In 1993, the world watched a legend of fear reach his final hours. Pablo Escobar, once a quiet boy from a small Colombian town, had risen to command an empire built on danger, money, and blood. His name carried two sides. To some, a man who helped the poor. To many others, a force who brought terror to an entire nation. His life moved between generosity and violence, between public praise and secret cruelty. Each step he took pulled Colombia deeper into chaos, shaping a history that would haunt generations. But this story does not begin with power. It begins long before the world knew his name, back in the days when he was only a child trying to understand the world he was born into. And from those early moments, the path that would change a country was already taking shape. Colombia entered the late 20th century carrying a quiet weight. Across its cities and mountains, the country lived in a space between hope and hardship. Many families believed change would come, but poverty continued to divide communities. Weak institutions struggled to support a population facing daily uncertainty. In this unsettled landscape, new black markets began to grow in the shadows. These markets offered fast money to some and danger to many others. Foreign demand for cocaine was rising, and the Andes became one of its main sources. What began as small, hidden operations soon expanded into powerful networks. Local farmers, pushed by poverty, joined the trade for survival. Smugglers learned new routes, moving their product across borders while avoiding the state's fragile control. Each step they took strengthened the underground economy, creating a force the government was not prepared to confront. Illegal groups began fighting for territory. Corruption spread through police stations, borders, and political offices. Bribes replaced laws, and trust faded as officials struggled to hold their ground. In the countryside, armed rebels added their own layer of violence, turning entire regions into battle zones. Ordinary people lived between these pressures, trapped by forces they could neither predict nor escape. Fear became part of daily life, shaping how communities moved, worked, and dreamed. As the cocaine trade expanded, Colombia entered a period where violence no longer shocked, it simply continued. Bombings, kidnappings, and extortion marked the slow rise of criminal power. Many believed the worst days were still ahead, but few understood how deeply one man would influence the coming storm. At this time, Pablo Escobar was only a young man in a growing nation, yet the conditions around him were shifting in ways that would one day carry him to global notoriety. These early tensions built the foundation for what followed. They created a path for new leaders in the criminal world, leaders who stepped into the vacuum left by institutions under strain. Colombia did not know the scale of the threat rising within its borders. It did not know how the cocaine trade would soon reshape its politics, its streets, and its people. Before Escobar's name became known around the world, the nation was already changing. The shadows were already spreading, and inside those shadows, the forces that would lift him into power were quietly forming, setting the stage for a rise that would alter Colombia's history forever. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on December 1st, 1949, in the quiet town of Rionegro, Colombia. His early world was shaped by simple routines, long days of work, and the modest dreams of a working-class family. Soon after his birth, his parents moved to Medellín, a growing city where opportunity mixed with hardship. In their small home, his mother taught school children while his father worked the land, each trying to keep the family steady in a country marked by inequality. For many children of their neighborhood, life followed a predictable path. But Escobar carried a different kind of energy. Restless, sharp, and hungry for more than what he saw around him. From a young age, he felt the weight of poverty as something he refused to accept. School offered structure, but it could not hold his full attention. Teachers saw intelligence, yet they also saw impatience, a boy who pushed against limits. Medellín gave him his first lessons about power and respect, lessons learned not from books, but from the streets. Small schemes began to fill his days. He moved between classmates, neighbors, and strangers with ease, showing a charm that hid early signs of defiance. These acts were small, but they carried the seed of something larger, a belief that rules were obstacles, not boundaries. As he entered his teenage years, Escobar's choices grew bolder. Local gangs, black markets, and petty crime formed an environment where ambition could grow without guidance. The economy around him offered few legal paths upward, and the illegal ones appeared faster, easier, and filled with the promise of escape. He watched men gain fear and respect through risk, and he studied them carefully. The idea of waiting for success no longer appealed to him. He wanted control over his own fate, even if that meant crossing lines others feared. His family tried to keep him on a safer path, but Medellín's shifting landscape held a stronger pull. The city was changing, shaped by new markets and rising criminal groups. Escobar stepped into these currents with growing confidence. Each illegal step brought him closer to people who recognized his boldness and his willingness to act without hesitation. His mind formed a split that would later define his entire life: the charm that won trust and the determination that ignored every rule in his way. By his late teens, the direction of his future had quietly locked into place. Crime had become both a habit and a doorway, one he walked through with purpose, not fear. The boy from Rionegro had already begun shaping the man he would become, and the streets of Medellín were now preparing him for a rise that would one day reach far beyond the city he grew up in, into a world that was not yet ready for his name. Escobar entered adulthood at a moment when Colombia was changing. In the early 1970s, the cocaine trade was no longer a quiet, hidden business. It was growing fast, fed by demand from across the hemisphere. What began as small movements of product through remote routes soon attracted young men searching for opportunity. Among them was Pablo Escobar, already known in Medellín's underground circles for his boldness and his ability to solve problems without hesitation. He stepped into this new world with the same ambition that had pushed him since childhood, but now the stakes were higher, and the rewards were far greater. At first, his role was small. Simple transport jobs, quiet exchanges, and limited partnerships allowed him to learn the structure of the trade. But each step revealed a truth he could not ignore. Cocaine brought wealth faster than anything he had ever touched. The speed of the profits, the weakness of government oversight, and the growing international demand drew him deeper into the business. What others treated as a risky opportunity, he treated as the beginning of something larger. Escobar soon decided he would not remain a minor player. He built alliances with smugglers operating across Medellín, people who shared his hunger and understood the value of loyalty backed by fear. These partnerships marked the first major turning point in his life. They gave him access to supply, to routes, and to networks that could expand with the right leadership. He believed he could be that leader. His charm opened doors. His ruthlessness kept them from closing. By the mid-1970s, Escobar had moved far beyond petty crime. He organized transport routes through isolated areas using hidden airstrips carved from the landscape. Small aircraft carried shipments north, and each successful flight strengthened the system he was building. Officials who stood in the way were bribed, pressured, or replaced. Corruption became a tool, not an obstacle. Every choice reflected a strategic mind willing to balance generosity with intimidation. As his operations expanded, Escobar's world shifted. The risks surrounding the cocaine trade were growing, but so was his confidence. Money flowed through his hands with a speed he had never imagined. Trust became a fragile resource, and danger became an everyday companion. He stepped deeper into a life where violence was not an exception, but a predictable part of business. Still, the success fueled him. Each victory strengthened his belief that he was rising towards something larger than simple profit. This period marked the moment when Pablo Escobar crossed a line he could never return from. The world he once knew, quiet, limited, and modest, was now replaced by one built on secrecy, power, and control. His decisions tied him to a future shaped by both ambition and blood. And as his influence grew, the foundations of the Medellín Cartel began to form around him, preparing the stage for a rise that would soon reach far beyond Colombia's borders. By the late 1970s, Pablo Escobar was no longer a small player in Colombia's criminal world. He was now helping shape what would soon become the most powerful cocaine organization on earth, the Medellín Cartel. The network grew from scattered groups and local smugglers into a unified force, driven by Escobar's ambition and a system built on both profit and fear. The trade expanded rapidly, feeding foreign demand and filling the cartel's pockets with levels of money the country had never seen. Each shipment leaving Colombia strengthened the organization and deepened Escobar's control. His methods blended charm with calculated brutality. Bribery became a tool he used with precision, reaching officials, police, and anyone who stood close to the corridors of power. Those who accepted his offers kept the system moving. Those who resisted faced threats or violent consequences. Escobar believed loyalty should be rewarded, but disobedience must be met with force. This balance shaped the internal order of the cartel, giving him influence that stretched far beyond Medellín's streets. Yet Escobar understood that power also came from public perception. Even as his criminal empire expanded, he worked to present himself as a man connected to ordinary people. He funded housing projects, built sports fields, and offered support in some of the poorest neighborhoods. Families who had long been ignored by the state saw him as someone who provided what the government did not. This image helped protect him, blurring the line between criminal and benefactor. But behind the generosity stood a man aware that admiration could shield him, even as his violent reach grew. In 1981, the cartel faced a threat that could have fractured its unity. Marta Nieves Ochoa, a relative of one of Escobar's key allies, was kidnapped by a guerrilla group. The cartel responded by forming a united front known as Muerte a Secuestradores, a campaign aimed at ending the kidnappings that targeted wealthy families involved in the cocaine trade. The crisis forced rival factions to cooperate more closely, strengthening the organization and reinforcing Escobar's role within it. This moment became a turning point, binding the cartel through shared fear and shared power. As the Medellín Cartel grew, its influence spread into politics, business, and the daily lives of Colombians. Escobar's wealth allowed him to finance campaigns and build a network of allies across institutions. The line between legal authority and criminal power blurred as corruption reached higher levels. Colombia entered a dangerous era, where decisions in government were quietly shaped by cartel interests, and violence served as a reminder of who controlled the shadows. With each passing year, Escobar rose further. His empire blended loyalty, fear, and ambition into a force that seemed unstoppable. The man who once searched for a way out of poverty now held a power that reached across borders. And as his control tightened, the consequences for the nation grew heavier, preparing the ground for the darkest chapter yet to come. By the 1980s, Pablo Escobar stood at the center of a storm that stretched far beyond Colombia's borders. The Medellín Cartel had become the dominant force behind most of the cocaine entering the United States. The The money was immense, and the power that came with it was even greater. But with that power came a growing willingness to use violence as a language. Escobar no longer simply controlled a business. He controlled a war, one that touched every corner of Colombian life. The lines between criminal world and national crisis began to disappear, leaving the country in a state of fear it had never known before. As the cartel expanded, Escobar's battle against extradition to the United States became the defining cause of his life. He believed extradition was a fate worse than death, a complete loss of control. To prevent it, he unleashed a campaign of intimidation that shook Colombia's institutions to their core. Judges received threats. Police officers became targets. Journalists who exposed cartel activities faced deadly consequences. Politicians who resisted the cartel found themselves living under constant danger. Every act of violence pushed the nation deeper into instability, creating an atmosphere where fear ruled daily life. Kidnappings became one of the cartel's most effective weapons. Families across Colombia lived with the constant fear that someone they loved might be taken as leverage in the cartel's struggle. Bombings tore through public spaces, leaving emotional wounds long after the physical damage was cleared. Escobar's message was clear. He would do whatever it took to stop extradition and maintain control over his empire. The government, the press, and civil society all found themselves confronting a force that refused to yield. One of the most tragic turning points occurred on November 6, 1985, when the M19 guerrilla group stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá. The siege lasted for hours, ending in devastating loss of life. While the guerrillas carried out the assault, the chaos inside the building provided an opportunity for cartel allies to destroy legal records tied to Escobar and other cocaine traffickers. This event deepened national trauma and raised painful questions about the reach of cartel influence. The Palace of Justice attack became a symbol of how deeply Colombia had fallen into a conflict driven by overlapping forces of rebellion, corruption, and organized crime. As the violence escalated, Escobar's world began to narrow. The man once admired by some for his generosity became a figure associated with terror. Even those who had once supported him started to feel the danger of standing too close to his war. Rival cartels saw his actions as reckless. Former allies doubted his judgment. The Colombian state, once weakened by corruption and fear, began to strengthen through new alliances, supported by international pressure and growing public demand for justice. Children grew up with memories of explosions echoing through cities. Families carried the weight of lives lost. Entire communities felt the consequences of a conflict driven by one man's determination to hold power. Escobar's reach had grown so dark that even he could not escape the emotional cost. Each act of violence only increased the pressure around him, closing the circle he once controlled so easily. As the decade moved forward, the forces against him gathered strength. His empire still held immense power, but the foundation beneath it was starting to crack. The nation was preparing for a confrontation that had become inevitable, and Pablo Escobar, once at the peak of influence, was moving toward a future where power would no longer protect him from what was coming next. In the early 1990s, Pablo Escobar's empire began to show deep fractures. The violence of the previous decade had pushed Colombia to its limits, and international pressure forced the state to take stronger action. Surrounded by threats from rival cartels and lawmakers determined to stop him, Escobar made a calculated decision. In 1991, he negotiated his own surrender, on the condition that he would be held in a prison of his choosing. The result was La Catedral, a facility built to his demands, complete with comforts that stood in sharp contrast to the chaos he had created outside its walls. For a time, La Catedral allowed Escobar to maintain the illusion of control. From within its walls, he continued directing cartel operations, settling disputes and managing the flow of money. The government believed he had been contained, but leaked reports revealed the truth. Escobar's power had not faded. It had only shifted location. This discovery triggered the breaking point. Colombian authorities attempted to move him to a stricter facility, but before they could act, Escobar slipped away. His escape marked the end of any remaining trust between him and the state, turning him into the target of one of the largest manhunts in the nation's history. Once outside La Catedral, Escobar faced a world that had changed. The unity that once protected him had fractured. Rival cartels, the same groups he had once overshadowed, joined forces with government units and U.S. agencies, each with their own reasons for bringing him down. Los Pepes, a vigilante organization made up of former enemies and betrayed associates, attacked his network relentlessly. Safe houses were found. Money pipelines were disrupted. The empire that once seemed untouchable began to shrink with alarming speed. Those who had stood beside him for years now felt the danger of remaining loyal. Former allies slowly turned away, either out of fear or the hope of survival. They cooperated with authorities, revealed secrets, or simply fled. The isolation that once seemed impossible for a man of his influence became a daily reality. Escobar moved constantly, trusting fewer people, relying on smaller groups, and watching the world he created collapse piece by piece. The emotional weight of this fall was heavy. The man who once commanded a nation's fear now lived in hiding, separated from his family, cut off from the wealth that had defined his rise. His movements grew desperate, driven by instinct more than strategy. Every message carried risk. Every safe house held uncertainty. Each day brought new losses, as authorities closed in and rivals hunted him with relentless determination. As his power faded, so did the myth that had surrounded him. Pablo Escobar was no longer the man who shaped Colombia's darkest years. He had become a fugitive, trapped by the very forces he once controlled. And with every passing hour, the space around him tightened, preparing him for the final chapter of a life built on ambition, violence, and the belief that he could outrun the consequences forever. On December 2nd, 1993, Pablo Escobar's long escape came to an end. After months of pursuit, Colombian forces located him in a modest neighborhood in Medellín. The chase ended on a rooftop where Escobar was killed after attempting to flee. His death closed one of the darkest and most violent chapters in Colombia's history. For many, it marked the fall of the man who had shaken the nation's foundations. For others, it brought a complicated mix of relief and sorrow, shaped by memories of both his generosity and his brutality. Across Colombia, the emotional response was divided. Families who had lost loved ones to bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings carried a grief that time could not easily heal. Their mourning reflected the deep scars his war had left behind. At the same time, communities that had received aid from Escobar remembered a man who had offered what the government had not. This contrast formed a painful duality, a figure who built homes for the poor, yet destroyed countless families through violence. His legacy was tied to both kindness and cruelty, woven tightly into the country's collective memory. With Escobar gone, the Medellín Cartel collapsed. The power it once held over cities, institutions, and daily life weakened almost overnight. Colombian authorities began reclaiming public spaces once controlled by fear. Laws grew stronger, corruption faced greater resistance, and international cooperation intensified. While violence did not disappear, the nation slowly began to rebuild, working to repair the damage left by years of conflict. The absence of Escobar created room for recovery, but it also forced Colombia to confront the long-term effects of a decade spent under the shadow of his influence. The world continued to study his life, trying to understand how one individual could rise so fast, gain so much power, and bring so much harm. His story raised questions about inequality, corruption, and the global demand for drugs, forces that had helped shape his empire. Scholars, journalists, and policymakers debated his legacy, analyzing what had allowed him to dominate a nation and why he became a symbol of both fear and fascination. His life became a cautionary tale about how ambition can turn destructive when it grows without limits. Escobar's legacy lives on in conversations about crime, leadership, and the cost of unchecked power. Even decades after his death, his impact remains visible in Colombia's institutions, its culture, and its memory. His rise and fall remind the world that a single person can alter a country's path, leaving consequences that last long after their story ends. And as Colombia continues to move forward, the lessons from his life remain a warning, showing how even the strongest empires, built on violence and ambition, eventually face the same fate, a final end that cannot be escaped.